even more aware than the average citizen that research had been going on in that field for something over a quarter of a century, and that the research was even speeding up. But the cold fact that a telepathy-detecting device had been invented somehow shocked his sense of propriety and his notions of privacy. It wasn't decent, that was all. There ought to be something sacred, he told himself angrily. He stopped walking and looked up. He was on Pennsylvania Avenue, heading toward the White House. That was no good. He went to the corner and turned off down the block. He had, he told himself, nothing at all to see the president about. Not yet, anyhow. The streets were dark and very peaceful. "I get my best ideas while walking," Malone said, without convincing himself. He thought back to the videotapes. The report on the original use of the machine itself had been on one of the first tapes, and Malone could still see and hear it. That was one thing he did have, he reflected. His memory was pretty good. Burris had been the first speaker on the tapes, and he'd given the serial and reference number in a cold, matter-of-fact voice. His face had been perfectly blank, and he looked just like the head of the FBI people were accustomed to seeing on their TV and newsreel screens. Malone wondered what had happened to him between the time the tapes had been made and the time he'd sent for Malone. Maybe the whole notion of telepathy was beginning to get him, Malone thought. Burris recited the standard tape opening in a rapid mumble, like a priest involved in the formula of the Mass. "Any person or agent unauthorized for this tape, please refrain from viewing further, under penalties as prescribed by law." Then he looked off, out past the screen to the left, and said, "Dr. Thomas O'Connor of Westinghouse Laboratories. Will you come here, Dr. O'Connor?" Dr. O'Connor came into the lighted square of screen slowly, looking all around him. "This is very fascinating," he said, blinking in the lamplight. "I hadn't realized that you people took so many precautions." He was, Malone thought, somewhere between 50 and 60, tall and thin, with skin so transparent that he nearly looked like a living X-ray. He had pale blue eyes and pale white hair, and, Malone thought, if there were ever a contest for the best-looking ghost, Dr. Thomas O'Connor would win it hands, or phalanges, down. "This is all necessary for the national security," Burris said a little sternly. "Oh," Dr. O'Connor said quickly. "I realize that, of course. Naturally. I can certainly see that." "Let's go ahead, shall we?" Burris said. O'Connor nodded. "Certainly, certainly." Burris said, "Well then," and paused. After a second, he started again. "Now, Dr. O'Connor, would you please give us a sort of verbal rundown on this for our records?" "Of course," Dr. O'Connor said. He smiled into the video cameras and cleared his throat. "I take it you don't want an explanation of how this machine works. I mean, you don't want a technical exposition, do you?"
"No," Burris said, and added, "not by any means. Just tell us what it does."
Dr. O'Connor suddenly reminded Malone of a professor he'd had in college for one of the law courses. He had, Malone thought, the same smiling gravity of demeanor, the same condescending attitude of absolute authority. It was clear that Dr. O'Connor lived in a world of his own, a world that was not even touched by the common run of men.
"Well," he began, "to put it very simply, the device indicates whether or not a man's mental, processes are being influenced by outside influences." He gave the cameras another little smile. "If you will allow me, I will demonstrate on the machine itself." He took 2 steps that carried him out of camera range, and returned wheeling a large, heavy-looking box.
Dangling from the metal covering were a number of wires and attachments. A long cord led from the box to the floor and snaked out of sight to the left.
"Now,"
Dr. O'Connor said. He selected a single lead, apparently, Malone thought, at random.
"This electrode."
"Just a moment, Doctor,"
Burris said. He was eyeing the machine with a combination of suspicion and awe.
"A while back you mentioned something about outside influences. Just what specifically does that mean?"
With some regret, Dr. O'Connor dropped the lead.
"Telepathy," he said. "By outside influences, I meant influences on the mind, such as telepathy or mind reading of some nature."
"I see," Burris said. "You can detect a telepath with this machine."
"I'm afraid."
"Well, some kind of a mind reader anyhow," Burris said. "We won't quarrel about terms."
"Certainly not,"
Dr. O'Connor said. The smile he turned on Burris was as cold and empty as the inside of Orbital Station 1.
"What I meant was, if you will permit me to continue, that we cannot detect any sort of telepathy or mind reader with this device. To be frank, I very much wish that we could. It would make everything a great deal simpler. However, the laws of psionics don't seem to operate that way."
"Well then," Burris said, "what does the thing do?"
His face wore a mask of confusion. Momentarily, Malone felt sorry for his chief. He could remember how he'd felt, himself, when that law professor had come up with a particularly baffling question in class.
"This machine,"
Dr. O'Connor said with authority,
"detects the slight variations in mental activity that occur when a person's mind is being read."
"You mean if my mind were being read right now?"
"Not right now," Dr. O'Connor said. "You see, the bulk of this machine is in Nevada. The structure is both too heavy and too delicate for transport. And there are other qualifications."
"I meant theoretically," Burris said.
"Theoretically," Dr. O'Connor began, and smiled again. "Theoretically, if your mind were being read, this machine would detect it, supposing that the machine were in operating condition, and all of the other qualifications had been met. You see, Mr. Burris, no matter how poor a telepath a man may be, he has some slight ability, even if only very slight, to detect the fact that his mind is being read."
"You mean if somebody was reading my mind, I'd know it?"
Burris said. His face showed, Malone realized, that he plainly disbelieved this statement.
"You would know it," Dr. O'Connor said, "but you would never know you knew it. To elucidate, in a normal person, like you, for instance, or even like myself, the state of having one's mind read merely results in a vague, almost subconscious feeling of irritation, something that could easily be attributed to minor worries or fluctuations in one's hormonal balance. The hormonal balance, Mr. Burris, is—"
"Thank you,"
Burris said with a trace of irritation.
"I know what hormones are."
"Ah, good," Dr. O'Connor said equably. "In any case, to continue. This machine interprets those specific feelings as indications that the mind is being, eavesdropped upon."
You could almost see the quotation marks around what Dr. O'Connor considered slang dropping into place, Malone thought.
"I see,"
Burris said with a disappointed air.
"But what do you mean it won't detect a telepath? Have you ever actually worked with a telepath?"
"Certainly we have," Dr. O'Connor said. "If we hadn't, how would we be able to tell that the machine was, in fact, indicating the presence of telepathy? the theoretical state of the art is not, at present, sufficiently developed to enable us to—"
"I see," Burris said hurriedly.